Now, Anthem Prep is especially honored to have with us here tonight as commencement speaker, Mr. Andrew Ellison. Mr. Ellison was the founding headmaster of the first Great Hearts Academy, Veritas Preparatory Academy. He spent many years leading this community until stepping up to lead Great Hearts on a larger scale as the assistant superintendent of upper schools in Phoenix. He now serves as the executive director in Great Hearts, Texas. Regardless of position, Mr. Ellison has been a visionary leader since the beginning of Great Hearts. We can all thank him for much of what Great Hearts is today. We're always grateful for his modeling of what it is to be a lover of learning in all situations, and you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone in the Great Hearts Network who has not been inspired by him. I now invite Mr. Ellison to the podium to give the commencement address.
Mr. Goodrich, thank you very much for those humbling and kind words of introduction. Ms. Seifert and Mr. Bedard, thank you very much for your remarks. And Mr. Bedard, I pray that I never am the object of your smoldering righteous indignation. Truly fearsome. I bring greetings to this community from deep in the heart of the Lone Star State, and especially from our beloved founder and friend, Mr. Brian Smith, here, first headmaster of Anthem Prep, and wife Catherine. I was informed just before the ceremony began that today is in fact Mr. Smith's birthday. And if he were here, I would spontaneously lead us all in singing happy birthday to him. He is not. I will spare you that torment. But I do want to share with you, this wasn't really part of my plan, Mr. Smith and his wife are actually leaving Great Hearts this year. They will be moving on, taking their family to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where Mrs. Dr. Catherine Smith has obtained a faculty position at Eastern University there. So even as Anthem Prep said farewell to the beloved Smiths a few years back, Great Hearts is now bidding them farewell as they head off for the East Coast. But there's much ado in Texas. I will not share with you all of it. Many old friends there, Mr. and Mrs. Altaga and others. Mr. and Mrs. Ferris, although they're not teaching for Great Hearts anymore, they're just up the road from San Antonio, where Mr. Ferris will hopefully soon be Dr. Ferris in a wonderful degree program there at the University of Texas in Austin. But I am here to speak to y'all as an Anthem Prep community and to share some reflections on this occasion of Commencement 2019. And graduates, I think you will recognize that when Great Hearts schools get together, we usually do a good job on occasions like this of talking about literature, talking about philosophy. We don't do nearly a good enough job of talking about mathematics and science on occasions like this. And one thing we usually don't do is talk about the study of history. And so that is something I am here to base my address on tonight. And the theme of my address in your honor is the School of History. So it is a commonplace, of course, to say one of the reasons we study history is to become better interpreters of our present. There's that cliched saying that those who do not remember their history are, of course, doomed to repeat it. Now, it's a dangerous oversimplification to say that history simply repeats itself. Knowledge of history, as you graduates have obtained through your studies here, is not sufficient to inform your actions. It's not sufficient to inform the actions of kings, queens, citizens, and statesmen. Every age must solve its own problems and respond to its own challenges. Inspiring as they may be, ancient Greeks, long-dead Romans, and great Americans like Washington, Lincoln, or FDR, they can't solve our problems for us. The 19th century German professor and philosopher, G.W.F. Hegel, one of your favorites, no doubt, from senior year Humane Letters, emphasized the error in this commonplace way of thinking. Hegel may have been guilty of overstatement, but he writes in one passage in the preface to his lectures on the philosophy of history that every age, every event, every moment in world history is so entirely unprecedented that the past can provide zero insight into it. What does give us insight? Well, not all that surprisingly for a German professor, Hegel claims that it's only his unique philosophical system, detailed in thousands of pages of unreadable, jargon-laden prose that can provide comprehensive understanding of the past, present, and future alike, interpreting and predicting with absolute and scientific certainty. As a great teacher of mine once said of Hegel, he's either got it exactly right or he's completely nuts. Not everything Hegel said was wacko, though. There's a flash of humor here and there. One of my favorite quips from that preface is where Hegel pokes fun at the moralizing pretensions of schoolmasters and history teachers, petty people who denounce someone like Alexander the Great for his violent ambitions and other moral faults, evidenced by his subjugation of Asia. The implication, of course, is that the school teacher is morally superior to Alexander, proven by the fact that not once in his entire teaching career has he ever subjugated Asia. Hegel also said the study of history was not to make us cleverer for next time, but to make us wiser for all time. Now, if I understand him correctly, I think the same thing could be said about your education here at Anthem Prep. Its purpose has not been to make you clever, not to train you for the needs of the moment or the present, not to prepare you for college and for jobs, but to help set you on a lifelong pursuit of wisdom and virtue. Not to make you smarter than fellow college freshmen next year, but to help you be wiser and happier for the rest of your lives. Now, another great teacher of mine once told me that, in his understanding, history was a laboratory. It was the lab in which the truth or falsity of political and moral philosophy could be tested and verified or falsified. I like this idea. For while, of course, we can, in argument, demonstrate the evils of 20th century totalitarianism, we can empirically verify them too. Look at the horror, slaughter, famine, genocide, physical destruction, the moral degradation wrought by Soviet communism and German Nazi terror, and it is clear that those ideologies are false, bad, and hideously ugly. On the other hand, look at American growth, stability, material prosperity, the ability to survive a civil war, and the steady sharing of the blessings of liberty to ever greater numbers of its citizens. It may seem that the founders' endorsement of a balanced and mixed constitution, also found in the thinking of Aristotle, might have some truth to it. Look at the way that the bold and unprecedented experiment in ancient Athenian democracy turns into reckless war-making, factional strife, abuse of justice, and rule by demagogues, and the critiques of pure democracy made by Plato and James Madison alike seem to be verified. Read what Rousseau says about something he calls the general will of the people, some mysterious force which must be grasped and acted upon by the true legislator, even if the vast majority of the people are unaware that it is their general will. And then look at the violence unleashed upon the people in the France of the 1790s, or the Russia, again, of 1917, by a fanatical revolutionary minority, claiming to be acting on behalf of those same people, most of whom opposed them. Was Rousseau's notion insightful, fruitful, true? We can read and discuss around the seminar table, as you have, but such theorizing can be, I might even say must be, complemented by careful observations in the lab of history. Now, the wonderful thing, of course, about the laboratory is it is a controlled environment. We can conduct our own experiments there in nation building, statecraft, war and peace, law, constitutions, revolution, and no one gets hurt, or at least nobody new gets hurt. Hegel rightly likened history to a slaughter bench, an altar upon which countless lives and the happiness of entire peoples have been sacrificed. As sober students of history, we should keep this grave truth in our minds always, never rejoicing in it as twisted evil geniuses like Robespierre, Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler did. So graduates, I'd like to ask you to step into the lab with me one last time here at Anthem Prep. Let's go to a lab with Professor Thucydides. Recall, if you will, that dry and often difficult book that you read from your junior Humane Letters classes, that great history of the Peloponnesian War. Now, of course, I see already people, eyes rolling, right? Everyone thinks Thucydides is you on the end there, I saw you. Everyone thinks Thucydides is no fun when compared to who? Herodotus. Everyone's right, by the way. But don't think for a minute that this judgment actually reflects poorly upon Thucydides. His history, which he consciously sketches in his opening chapters as a kind of anti-Herodotus, is an underrated masterpiece, a work of epoch-making and genre-forging genius, one of the most important books ever written. You are very lucky that you've read it. Now, while Herodotus is entertaining and dramatic and still very close to the epic tradition of poetry and storytelling, Thucydides is a real original, sober, analytical, rational, a deep thinker about historical and political causes and effects. I prefer to think of Thucydides as the real father of history. That's a name sometimes called Herodotus. Herodotus is, to my mind, more the jolly old grandfather of history, telling tall tales and handing out treats to the children. Recall with me now Thucydides' great funeral oration of the Athenian leader Pericles, an inspiring vision of the balanced glory and prosperity of Athens in its golden age, a united and free society at its zenith. I quote from it at length. Thucydides has the great Athenian general say, "Our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators. Our administration favors the many instead of the few. The laws afford equal justice to all in their private differences. Advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. There, far from exercising a jealous surveillance over each other, we do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbor for doing this or that or what he likes, or even to indulge in those injurious and scolding looks, which cannot fail to be offensive, even though they inflict no real harm. But all this ease in our private relations does not make us a lawless people. Fear and respect are our chief safeguards against this, teaching us to obey magistrates and laws, particularly those laws that protect the injured, whether they are actually written down in the statute books or belong to that code which, although unwritten, cannot be broken without disgrace. We throw our city open to the world, and we never exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing. We cultivate refinement without extravagance, and knowledge without frivolity. Wealth we employ more for use than for vulgar display. Instead of looking on discussion as a stumbling block or hindrance to action, we think it is an indispensable preliminary to any wise political action at all. In our national enterprises, we present the singular spectacle of both daring and deliberation, each carried to its highest point. Although in the rest of mankind, decision is usually the fruit of ignorance and hesitation the fruit of reflection. In generosity, we are all equally singular. It is only the Athenians who, fearless of consequences, confer their benefits, not from calculations of interest or expediency, but in the confidence of our liberality. I stop the quotation there. You may recall at the climax of this address, Pericles proclaims that Athens is the school of Hellas, an education for the rest of Greece, a model of what Greeks can be. It is a vision that can educate us, a vision of a society that manages to be both free and law-abiding, bold and active and thoughtful, reflective in its policies and politics, prosperous and tough, tolerant of different ways of life and equally committed to virtue and excellence, somehow both pluralistic and united, open to foreigners, and vigorous in foreign wars when attacked. It is a beautiful and inspiring thing, a vision of a society that is orderly and free alike. Pericles concludes, speaking to his fellow Athenians, "You must yourselves realize the power of Athens and feed your eyes upon her from day to day until love of her fills your hearts. And then when all her greatness shall break upon you, you must reflect it was by courage, sense of duty, and a keen feeling of honor in action that men were enabled to win all of this for you." Sublime stuff. Of course, you remember what happens next. Just a matter of sentences after Pericles' speech is over, the historian Thucydides tells us of the first appearance of the devastating plague that ravaged Athens throughout that summer of the year 430. The beautiful portrait Pericles has painted of a balanced, healthy, and powerful Athens is replaced by scenes of horror. Corpses lying in the streets, fear and panic amongst the healthy, utter despair by the infected at their first signs of disease. Manners, religious rites, ancient customs in sudden and near universal disregard. A wave of criminality as men ceased to fear law and legal punishment, certain that they, or better yet, all the judges, would die of disease before anyone could be brought to trial. It withers like a summer flower. It collapses like a house of cards. Pericles' Athens does not last. Pericles himself dies in that plague, but not before our historian Thucydides depicts the fickle Athenian people blaming him for all their problems and for the war with Sparta, which they once so enthusiastically supported, but no longer have the stomach for. After telling us of his death, Thucydides comments that Athens' failure to follow his restrained and moderate foreign policy brought it to ruin in the subsequent decades of war, a war that exhausted all of Greece before the final Athenian defeat. In those hundreds of pages that you had to read after that take us from Pericles' death in 430 to nearly the end of the war in 404, Thucydides now shows us not a noble and beautiful Athens, but a city that commits acts of outrageous savagery against its enemies. Think of that shocking Melian dialogue in which the arrogant and merciless Athenian delegate brazenly tells the helpless, defeated Milesians, "We will do whatever we want with you, because that is what the strong do to the weak. That is what they have always done and what they always will do." Our author shows us a once responsible and restrained Athens that for some reason trusts the outrageous fraud and rich upper-class charlatan Alcibiades, such appalling character and such charm, with its supreme political power. He shows us an Athens that makes a mockery of its own law and justice and starts visiting fratricidal revenge punishments on its good and faithful public servants for the slightest misfortunes of war. He shows us an Athens which, late in the conflict, detached from reality, under the sway of the despicable Alcibiades, foolishly gambles all of its strength upon that Sicilian expedition, an unnecessary, massive foreign campaign of conquest that is as audacious and as doomed as Napoleon or Hitler's invasions of Russia. From the glory of Periclean Athens to the depths of defeat, those Athenian prisoners thrown in the gravel pits to die, and the entire populace certain they will now be put to the sword just as they have treated others. It is a sobering history of downfall, the tragedy of Athens, just as capable of moving us to pity and fear as Oedipus or any of the other Greek tragedies. Now, if Pericles' great funeral speech is a beautiful picture of a balanced, prosperous, and healthy society, maybe the greatest such image from the ancient world, later on in the book, Thucydides also gives us a powerful, condensed, and shocking portrait of what it looks like when social order is completely torn apart. This passage is one of my favorites in all of the Western canon. It's that one about revolutions throughout Greece in Book 3. Here at this point, Thucydides is telling us it wasn't just Athens that fell apart. Every city in Greece was sent into upheavals, caught in the storm of the war between the Athenians and the Spartans. I quote from this passage at length. Thucydides writes, "The whole Hellenic world was convulsed. The sufferings which revolution entailed upon the cities were many and terrible, such as have occurred and will always occur as long as the nature of mankind remains the same. Revolution ran its course from city to city. Words had to change their ordinary meaning and to take that which was now given to them. Reckless audacity came to be considered courage of a loyal party supporter. Prudent hesitation, cowardice. Moderation, a cloak for unmanliness. The ability to see multiple sides of a question, incapacity to act on any. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. Preemptive plotting, justifiable self-defense. The advocate of extreme measures was always held to be trustworthy. His milder opponent, a man to be held in suspicion and contempt. To succeed in a plot or a scheme was to prove yourself clever. To detect or thwart a plot, real or imagined, still cleverer. But to refuse to do either was considered a betrayal of your party and cowardice before your adversaries. Revenge was held of more account than self-preservation. Oaths of reconciliation only held good as long as you had no other weapon at hand to kill your enemy. The leaders in the cities made the fairest professions, the one side with the cry of political equality and democracy, the other with a moderate conservatism and oligarchy. But they both sought prizes for themselves in those public interests which they pretended to cherish, and stopping at nothing in their struggles for ascendancy, engaged in excesses. In their acts of vengeance, they went to even greater lengths, not limiting themselves to what justice or the common good demanded. Religion was in honor with neither party, but the use of fair and lofty phrases to arrive at criminal ends was in high reputation. Meanwhile, the moderate part of the citizens perished between the two camps, either for not joining in the quarrel or because the envy of the opposing parties would not allow them to escape. Every form of iniquity took root in Greece by reason of troubles. The ancient simplicity into which honor so largely entered was laughed at and disappeared. Society became divided into camps in which no man trusted his fellow. Human nature, always rebelling against law, and now its master, gladly showed itself ungoverned in passion, above respect for justice, and the enemy of all authority. Indeed, men too often take upon themselves in the prosecution of their revenge to set the example of doing away with those general laws to which everyone can look for salvation in times of adversity, instead of allowing those laws to subsist against the day of danger when their aid may be required. I stop the quote there. This is an image every bit as frightening and sobering as Pericles' funeral speech is beautiful and inspiring. The author tells us that this kind of disorder will always occur because that's the direction that human nature tends. It starts with the abuse and manipulation of language. Next comes fanatical and unrestrained action. Then the factional spirit of party versus party in a winner-take-all battle. The respective visions of liberty and conservatism for the common good of all become empty slogans, barely covering each party's struggle to dominate. Law becomes a tool to punish and destroy fellow citizens, rather than as a common protector for all. Honor, honesty, decency, trampled upon and mocked. Trust and tolerance between fellow citizens vanish. The center does not hold. The moderate part perishes, swallowed up by radicalized factions, and the only choices left are between extremisms. So what is Thucydides' message? What's the lesson to be learned in this course in the School of History? What conclusions should we draw from these observations in the laboratory of the Peloponnesian War? In the true spirit of Anthem prep and Socratic inquiry, I will of course tell you nothing. No answers. You must think, discern, weigh, consider, criticize, and reflect. You must integrate what you have learned from the great books, what you have learned from your friends and classmates and teachers. You must integrate what you believe about the universe and humanity and what you see and experience around you. It is for you to discover, hypothesize, agree, disagree, or suspend judgment. But aim at nothing less than the truth. Accept no falsity, no nonsense, no party line, no philosophical system created by a German professor with delusions of omniscience. What is my message to you? Now, I believe I have a responsibility to say something here, not just to recapitulate a long-forgotten reading from 11th grade Humane Letters and answer your questions with more questions. My message to you, graduates, is this. Pericles boasted that Athens was the school of Greece. I urge you, be a school to your generation, an education to your peers, an example and inspiration to your elders. Teach your culture and your country and your bosses and your professors and your candidates vying for your votes and your elected leaders how they should be. Teach them how to be reflective, to eschew extremism of all sorts. Teach them how to be generous, fair-minded, how to trust their fellow citizens. Teach them what you have learned here at your school, that philosophical disagreement need not dissolve the deeper ties of friendship, that there is no intellectual argument that can't be smoothed over by a senior trip, a class play, singing together, or a good game of Foursquare. Teach your generation and your elders to respect impartial law and justice and moderation and self-restraint. Teach us that politics is not everything, that beautiful music, Shakespeare, a Euclidean proof, a Latin poem, or a Russian novel are vastly more important than fashion, faction, and party strife. Teach our world that harmony, concord, and political friendship in a nation, in a state, are rare and precious, and won only with difficulty over generations, and that they should never be thrown away for this or that cause of the moment. Graduates, I urge you to be that center, that moderate and tolerant and morally serious middle that is needed to keep every community and state together. Teach the world what you have learned from Socrates, that the pursuit of justice is not about seeking and punishing the alleged wrongs of others, but the right ordering of your own soul, about building the ideal city, the Kallipolis, inside you. Teach the world what you have learned from Dmitri, Ivan, and Father Zosima, that we are all guilty, that we all deserve some kind of punishment, and that we should thus accept hardship with humility, not with screams of protest over the smallest perceived slight or injury. Underlying it all, graduates, I borrow from Pericles, and I urge you, you must yourselves realize the power of this community, your class and your school. Feed your soul with the memory of these things from day to day, no matter how far away you travel. Then your love of this school and your gratitude for what she has given you will fill your hearts. Years from now, all her greatness shall break upon you, and you must reflect that it was out of love, courage, sacrifice, labor, duty, and the keen pursuit of the beautiful that your teachers and your parents built this school and made this possible for all of you. Graduates of 2019, take Anthem Prep with you as you leave. Take your school with you forever. Be a school to your generation. Teach the world.